Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. If relationships are the key to happiness, communication is the doorway, and communication is most engaging when we use stories as our foundation. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect, but what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you, and you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into some of the lessons from those situations. When I'm working with clients, I remind them to listen for understanding and not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm actually asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. I weighed under 100 pounds when I graduated from college. My mother came into town for graduation and stared at me. "Are you anorexic?" "No, Mom, I'm just broke." She was heartbroken that I hadn't told her I was struggling. She couldn't believe I would rather go without food than ask her for help. Really, though, that wasn't it at all. I simply didn't consider asking for help. I've written this before. I'm independent. After traveling through Australia and New Zealand by myself, I was fiercely independent. It just never occurred to me to ask for help. My mother and I have always been close. We've also always been like oil and water. I've never doubted her love for me. There has never been a doubt that she would be there for me no matter what, and that she would always have my back. That's why when I graduated from college, I had kind of a hard time saying goodbye to her. We didn't have a plan for the next time we'd see each other. She flew in from Sacramento to Fort Collins for my graduation, and we had a great weekend full of fun celebrations. And then the weekend was over, and I was driving her to the airport. We were chatting away on the ride to that tiny airport in Fort Collins. I was about to head off to my next adventure, a coveted position as a paid intern in Washington, D.C. with the U.S. International Trade Commission. As I drove her in my little blue Chevette, I wasn't thinking at all about her leaving. I was yammering about packing up my apartment, working my shift at a restaurant on New Year's Eve, and then finishing packing, putting everything into my little car to head to Colorado Springs to see my dad and sister before moving across the country. It was a full plate, and my mind was spinning. I pulled up at the entrance to the airport and helped my mom get her luggage out of the car. We hugged, and her eyes teared up. I gave her that warning expression, "Don't start, Mom," and I walked her just inside the automatic doors. We hugged again, and as I walked away, I watched her go through that tiny little thing that they considered security. I got into my car and started to drive down the bumpy dirt road back to I-25. It was December and the road was a little slippery, which is why, when I had a moment of sheer panic, slammed on my brakes to make a U-turn, my 180 became a 360. Somehow I managed to turn the car back toward the airport without seeing clearly through my streaming tears. I parked right in front in the no parking zone and ran inside the airport. My mother had gone through that little metal detector that was considered security back then and was sitting in a tiny waiting area at the gate. I ran right through that metal detector, right past the security guard, and as my mother saw me coming, tears streaming down my face, she stood up to grab me. We hugged fiercely, both of us crying in relief, in love, and in grief. Yes, I'd call it grief. It was the end of an era for our relationship. Even though we had been living over 1,000 miles apart for more than 5 years, we always knew when we'd see each other again. We always had a plan. But now I was on my way to adulting, moving to a big city and a big job, at least that's how I saw it, and I was scared. Looking back, I can see that we were grieving that loss, though we were both excited for the future. At the time, all I knew was that I was leaving the comfort of young adulthood and taking on another mighty adventure all by myself. I cry every time I think about that goodbye, partly because that memory remains so strong, that feeling of loss and fear. The other reason my eyes fill when I think of that event is because I can now imagine my mother's conflicting feelings of sadness and joy. Joy for my achievement of graduation, my upcoming adventure, joy at the feeling that I still needed her and loved her, and sadness at the end of this era in our relationship. This was the goodbye for her that signaled real time between visits and hugs. It signaled a real difference in our relationship. Thankfully, these days we make plans to see each other regularly, and our relationship has only grown and improved. When I need her, she's there. She arrived on my due date when our first son was going to be born. She stayed until a couple days after he was born. She gave him his first bath and took his tiny footprints. 6 months later, she came back to D.C. to help me pack for our move across the country to Montana. Her dedication to writing on each box every single thing she packed in it made it possible for us to settle into our rented house pretty quickly. And when we bought our first house a year later, she was the one that sent us a gift certificate for the light fixture we desperately wanted to replace. There was a really ugly one in our living room, but we were going to have to wait because we were pretty house poor when we bought our first house. I still have trouble asking for help, but I've definitely improved over the years. Every time I'm about to jump into a new adventure, that memory, that story, pops into my head. Sometimes I call her to share what I'm excited and nervous about so I can feel that same relief I felt when we hugged inside the airport. I'm grateful for that memory for a couple of reasons. Even though my heart was broken and I was really scared, I continued down that path for my adventure, and it all turned out just fine. That gives me the courage to continue on whatever path is currently opening up before me. If I could handle that, I can handle this. When I look at my own children and their independence and adventures, I remember my mother's words that day. You'll be fine. You're smart, you're resourceful, you have all the tools you need to succeed in whatever you choose. And I'm here, no matter what, when you need me. I'm about to step into another adventure. I'm pretty excited. I'm nervous. I'm really nervous, but I still have my mother's words in my head. So here are my questions for you. What stories from your past can help you overcome fear of a future challenge? What do you need to hear? What do you need to think and to know before you step off into your next adventure and take another risk? That voice can be your own. You don't need someone else to tell you what you need to hear. Remember those stories from your past that gave you the evidence that you can face any challenges in front of you. Tell yourself those stories. Take the next step. Trust your instincts. Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You. How you share them will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?